Hi, I'm Matt Stoller, and welcome to another Big Breakdown. Today, I'm going to talk about what the Russian invasion of Ukraine has revealed about our own economic vulnerability. I don't want to frighten anyone, but you should know that this stuff keeps me up at night. I'm a little weird that way. I think about economics and collapse, but it scares me. So if economic doomsday scenarios scare you, then stay away from this video. Also, in the video today, I'm going to have a clip from a Chinese action movie. It's a pretty cool movie, but it's also fairly bloody. So you have been warned about all the scary stuff. All right, so I'm an analyst. I look at corporate power, economics, not usually geopolitics and war. But in reality, the two things are intertwined. And so we've all seen the photos and videos of the war in Ukraine. But what about what is happening in Russia itself? Now, the Western response to the invasion of Ukraine has been mostly economic in the form of sanctions. We cut off Russian banks from being able to trade in dollars. We block the imports and exports from or to Russia of things that they want or that they need. And let's take a look at some of the videos coming out of Russia, which are nowhere near as dramatic as what we're seeing in Ukraine, but are still incredibly important, maybe even more important. So this is a video of Russians waiting in line to withdraw money from a bank. The Russian economy is very clearly in trouble, maybe even collapsing, because everyone in every banking system, no matter where they are in the world, relies on access to dollars. And we've cut off their access to our currency. As a result, Russian banks are having serious problems. The West has caused a Russian bank run. We have destabilized the Russian economy, and we're throwing ordinary Russians into poverty. It's almost impossible for Russian firms to buy from the West to resupply their factories. The goal is to stop the Russian military machine, and it's probably working, all without firing a shot. Now, the sanctions, the economic actions, go far beyond banks, of course. So Maersk is one of the largest ocean carrier firms in the world. I think it's actually the largest, and it just cut off Russia from trade. Most of the other ocean carrier firms, not all of them, but most of them have also cut off Russia and Ukraine. Now, whatever you think about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Putin's goal at this point, his goal is likely to displace the Western system and replace it with one in which there are more authoritarian norms. Now, he made that clear himself late last month in a speech about Greater Russia. But sanctions also do some damage to us. Since the beginning of this year, tensions between Russia and Ukraine and just the possibility of sanctions have caused the price of oil to go from about $80 to about $110, $120 a barrel. Now, the US imports 21% of its gasoline from Russia, and Americans have seen the prices at the pump reflect these increasing prices. And this is true even as our sanctions exclude energy, meaning we still want to continue buying oil and gas from Russia so that the prices don't go up even more. We're not sanctioning their energy sector. Now, fertilizer prices have also increased since Russia and its ally Belarus make roughly 40% of the global supply of certain types of fertilizer. And that's a really big deal for food prices, which are also up. Still, Russia's economy is smaller than California's, and we don't actually rely on Russia or Ukraine for very much. We imported just $29 billion of goods and services from Russia last year, which is very little in our $20 trillion plus economy. A lot of our companies, from Exxon to General Motors, have pulled out of Russia, but our companies don't really have to do business there. Shareholders don't care that much. It's just not that big a deal. Now, yeah, Russia drills oil, it makes vodka, rocket engines, and Ukraine produces wheat, corn, barley, sunflower seeds, and so forth. But the US can and does source these goods elsewhere, including from ourselves. We are actually a giant agricultural power. Now, side note, this is not true everywhere. A lot of countries from Egypt to Israel and across the Middle East and Africa, they do rely on Ukrainian or Russian wheat. The bottom line is that the United States, and more broadly, Europe and the West, can address Vladimir Putin's geopolitical choices relatively uncoerced by Russian economic influence. They just can't hurt us very much economically, at least not in the short term. I don't want to overstate this. It's possible there are, maybe even probable that there are critical supply chain links going through Russia and Ukraine. You don't always know you'll need a small critical piece of infrastructure until you do. There are shipping problems and other issues that we're experiencing as well. But more to the point, we aren't very good at tolerating pain. I mentioned that we aren't sanctioning Russian oil. The Russians can take bank runs, maybe even economic collapse, but we can't even take higher gas prices at the pump. Still, our sanctions are working. Russia, however, isn't the only authoritarian country that wants to displace the Western system of international norms. Now, I'm not saying that this system is worth preserving without serious changes. The US launched a war of choice against Iraq that killed hundreds of thousands, and then Europe and the US did so against Syria and Libya as well. I'm not even going to get into Yemen and what's happening there currently. We have not reckoned with these gross violations of the values that we have pretended to uphold. But it's clear or probable that if the Western system falls, something much more violent, dangerous, and authoritarian is probably what will replace it. Economic sanctions have been the tool that we've been using to hold back Russian aggression without going to war ourselves, without risking troops, without risking nuclear war. And the key to sanctions with Russia or anywhere else is that we don't rely on Russia economically, but Russia relies on us. But imagine a different world. Let's say that Russia made all or most of, like our iPhones or consumer electronics, critical chemicals. What if Russia had the second largest economy in the world and one that nearly every large firm needed to commit to in order to make shareholders happy? Would it be so easy to levy sanctions against that Russia? The answer, of course, is no. And if that Russia chose to invade other countries or throw its weight around, we couldn't impose sanctions on them without hurting ourselves very badly, and it would be much harder to hold together an international coalition. I think you can see where I'm headed next. There is a country that has all of these characteristics: China. The Chinese have the second largest economy in the world, and it is the most populous nation in the world. It is also, more importantly, the world's factory. The US alone imports more than $500 billion of goods and services from China. Japan, Germany, indeed the entire world at this point is dependent on Chinese exports. Remember how US nurses wore garbage bags when COVID first hit? That's because we couldn't get enough personal protective equipment from China, and frankly, neither could anywhere else. Like Russia, China is pretty much hostile to the United States, the Chinese government. Chinese newspapers, which are state-run, regularly attack America in deeply personal tones. Here, for example, is Hu Xijin, a key voice for China with the Global Times. And he attacks the US, blames the US for the war in Ukraine, which is a common line from Chinese spokespeople and Chinese newspapers. And he says that the US is a, quote, gang leader who bluffs a lot but is timid at critical moments. Its allies have seen through this. China has even built a government-approved film industry in which it regularly shows Americans as villains and America as a land full of evil, malevolent bureaucrats and bad guys. Now, whether this is true or not, and I don't think it is, I think it's cartoonish, this is the propaganda that China is showing to its citizens and actually showing to people all over the world where it can. Now, I'm going to show you a clip of a famous Chinese movie called Wolf Warrior 2, which did incredibly well. It's a pretty violent movie. It's kind of like Lethal Weapon or Rambo. But the movie, it's important because it was so popular in China that it is actually among the top 100 grossing films ever. It is basically a Chinese version of Rambo with America as the villain. And the production values are really high. Like, it's a cool movie. China imported techniques from Hollywood, and they use them to make movies that are of comparable quality. So in this first clip, here's the way that the filmmakers portray Americans as violent racists who despise non-white people or look down on non-white people, especially the Chinese. The clip is during the final battle when the Chinese hero, who's a special forces warrior, is nearly killed by the American warlord, whose name is Big Daddy.
People like you will always be inferior to people like me. Get used to it. Get fucking used to it.
After this, the fight continues, and finally, the hero, his name is Lung Fang, and he's again, I said this before, a Chinese Special Forces soldier, turns the tables on Big Daddy. If you've seen any action movie ever, you know how it goes. The hero almost dies, the skin of his teeth, right? But then turns the table and kills the villain. Now, this next scene, when it happens, is a little gross, so you've been warned. But what's important is what the Chinese hero Feng says at the end.
那他妈是以前。
That's fucking history. That's what he says. And that is a statement from the Chinese government to the Chinese people and to people all over the world who watch this movie. Now, it's a cool fight. I can see why the movie did well. It's Hollywood level production. But what's important here is that it's not Hollywood. Hollywood is run by and large by private firms whose real goal is just to make a bunch of money. The Chinese government, by contrast, controls everything in its movies. They have a big censorship department. And they pay special attention to key geopolitical arguments, like how Americans and Chinese soldiers are portrayed, or how the Chinese military and the American military are portrayed. China's place in the world is very important in these movies, and the Chinese government supervises it very closely. Now, what's important is that the Chinese government actually wants its people to see the world in racialized terms. They want their people to fear Americans and learn that there is a global conflict of civilizations coming, one that China intends to win. It's not actually that different from some hardliners in the US who also use racist framing to characterize the actions of the Chinese government. The difference is that in China, hardline anti-Americanism is not only spread everywhere through explicit government control and censorship, but it is actually government policy and has been for decades. Chinese Foreign Service members, their diplomats, are actually now known as wolf warrior diplomats after this movie because of how aggressive and nationalistic they have become. For example, here's a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman blaming the US for covering up the American origins of COVID. Basically, Chinese diplomats are trained to attack American legitimacy as a strategy for displacing American and Western power. And that is absolutely government policy. The Chinese government feels that for China to become as powerful as it should be, America must lose. Now, putting aside the moral issues of this kind of conflict for a second, here's the problem, the practical problem for us, if you're a realist and a strategist. Unlike Russia, America, we do need China desperately. When Donald Trump put tariffs on a small number of Chinese goods, relatively small number, our own corporations freaked out. And from 2017 to 2019, in a series of hearings, a lot of companies told the government just how dependent we are on Chinese production. My organization summarized these comments. I've put a link to the spreadsheet in the description of this video. You can download it and look at all of our dependencies. But here's a very, very short list of products that we depend on China for. I mean, the list is much longer. I just picked these out. It's somewhat random. Solar panels, printed circuit boards, active pharmaceutical ingredients, prom dresses, fracking fluid inputs, routers, consumer robotics, specialty chemicals, electronic components, tiki torches, point-of-sale terminals, vitamin C, gantry cranes, and the ink that goes into dollar bills. But that's not my favorite one, the ink that goes into the dollar. My favorite comment in these hearings on Chinese tariffs was from a guy named Stan Jantz from the Bible Lobby. Now, I don't mean that he had some religious agenda here. I mean, he actually represents the Evangelical Publishers Association, which sells Bibles. Here he is explaining to the Trump administration why they shouldn't put tariffs on Bibles that are printed and then imported from China. Chinese printers have developed the technology and the artistry to produce the kind of Bibles people want, which is why over 50% of the Bibles published by ECPA members are printed in China. In fact, more Bibles are printed in China than in any other country on earth. Now, he went on to say that this is actually a problem for religious freedom because American printers simply don't have the capacity to print enough Bibles for Americans. And the people who, quote unquote, buy and read the Bible would potentially have to pay a much higher price, perhaps higher than they could justify. Christians depend on the Bible for their daily input of spiritual nourishment. Some publishers believe that such a tariff would place a practical limitation on religious freedom. Okay, printing technology is 500 years old. So this is really, really bad in terms of dependency. Now, like if you just look at other supply chains, it's bad when Russia and Ukraine go offline. There are problems. We can manage it, but there are problems. If China shuts down, if we try to sanction China that way, forget it. Just forget it. Let's look at ocean carriers. 7 of the top 10 biggest container ports by volume in the world are in China. You just can't shut it down. The US used to lead the world in shipping. Just to give some context, we had over 60% of the global merchant marine in 1945. Today, we have no major American ocean shipping firms. We basically have no merchant marine, no ships that move stuff in international waters. We are reliant on ships run by, among others, Chinese operators. And they actually own and run port terminals all over the United States. In other words, without China, there just is no global supply chain. And that's not to mention all of our corporations who are absolutely desperate to do business there. Apple CEO Tim Cook, who regularly scoffs in the US when asked for his company to pay its fair share of taxes, pledged to the Chinese government years ago that his firm would spend hundreds of billions of dollars building up Chinese tech infrastructure and transferring technology to the country, which he did. It's not just Apple, it's virtually everyone. So I picked a corporation at random. I've been reading investor calls. I like to do this. I'm kind of weird that way. But here's Unilever. It's a large consumer packaged products company. Unilever sees China is so important that it actually gives separate briefings to its investors on its subsidiary to China. Now, in the slide, it says the key message to investors is that winning in China is a strategic priority for Unilever. And it talks about how it's their 3rd biggest market and how it's absolutely important for them to keep growing it there. It's fast growing. So with all of these companies, all of that muscle, lobbying muscle in the US that wants to have deep-seated relationships in China, both as a market and as an exporter, would it be so easy to levy sanctions against China? The answer, of course, is no. That may not be such a problem if we could manage to avoid conflict with China. But China has made it clear that it wants to take over Taiwan with military force if necessary. And Taiwan is where we get 80% of our high-end semiconductors, which we desperately need. Semiconductors go into everything from computers to farm equipment to phones to toys to cars. 40% of our manufacturing capacity is dependent on semiconductor inputs. Taiwan is also a long-standing security partner with the United States, and we've been transferring technology to Taiwan for decades. China regularly sends fighter jets to penetrate Taiwanese defenses. They're constantly talking about war. The problem is that if this happens, without Taiwan, the US economy also comes to a halt. So it's a really dangerous situation. Now, as Russia bombs Ukraine, as they invade Ukraine, we have the luxury of sitting back and choosing to engage in sanctions or not. We can cheer for the Ukrainians, don't have to send soldiers, we can affect Russia. There's definitely going to be blowback against us for what we're doing, maybe a horrific blowback, depending on what we do, depending on whether we start to use military force. But Russia, at least economically, cannot hurt us that badly. China, however, isn't vulnerable to economic sanctions the way that Russia is. In fact, it might just be the opposite scenario. China right now is preparing to engage in sanctions itself, and actually has. It just put out its first export control law. And China is actually levying sanctions over the Taiwan issue already. Take Lithuania. They say they're not, but they are. So take Lithuania, a small country in Eastern Europe, which allowed Taiwan to open a de facto embassy, which is kind of one of the red lines for the Chinese government. What happened next? China turned Lithuania quietly into a pariah state. The Chinese government not only cut off imports from Lithuania, but said that any item with any Lithuanian components could not come into China. And remember, Lithuania is a member of the European Unions. We have globalized supply chains, so Lithuanian stuff goes into a lot of different things. Now, rather than standing up for this small country Lithuania and its geopolitical choices, the rest of the European Union buckled. European factories may start moving out of Lithuania, or investors are going to stop investing there and put their factories elsewhere. And this is creating a crisis for the government. The message from China is very clear. Now you might say, well, that's Lithuania. They are small and we're not. But China does this to our American firms and celebrities, from LeBron James and the NBA to Marriott and Starbucks. Last May, it was John Cena's turn. Now, Cena had accidentally referred to Taiwan as a country in one interview promoting his latest movie. He issued a groveling apology in Chinese, which was roundly and rightfully mocked. But still, it's not going to change Hollywood, the fact that someone made fun of John Cena. Hollywood executives are very aware of what they can and can't say. So while China produces excellent action movies and television with Americans as the villains and distributes them worldwide, it also controls Hollywood through its economic power and ensures that China is portrayed in a favorable light to Americans and to a global audience. Now, our corporate sector and our supply chains are so intertwined with Chinese power and economic influence that these kinds of apologies are common. The only reason it was weird in Cena's case is because he usually doesn't do the heel turn. Regardless, the point is that we've allowed so much of our industry to go to China that if we were to ever try to sanction that country, it could simply block us from getting iPhones and thousands of other critical products we need, from medicine to electronics to chemical inputs to inputs for food. It could cut us off our corporations from access to their markets, blow a giant crater in our own stock market. Right now, we can still do something to move our supply chains back from China and reorient our corporate sectors so that our executives have some recognition of an obligation to America, to democracy. Now, one aspect of that involves breaking up monopolies so that we aren't reliant on any one firm for a key product or to distribute something, like Apple. But it will require a lot of work at every level of our society. In many ways, the Trump administration started it, the Biden administration is continuing this work, but it's not enough yet. And regardless, we have to act quickly to protect ourselves. If we do not, during the next major geopolitical upheaval, it may not be Russians experiencing bank runs and economic chaos as a result of sanctions. It might be all of us. Now, thanks for watching. If you'd like to know more about big business and how our economy really works, you can sign up below for my market power focused newsletter, Big. Have a good one.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it, you get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.